World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We begin with tensions over Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry says a partial troop withdrawal from its border with Ukraine is underway. The Kremlin shares a video showing a column of tanks and military vehicles leaving Crimea. Following talks Tuesday with the German chancellor, Russian President Vladimir Putin stressed that he's not seeking war over Ukraine. But Russia's gestures have been met with skepticism in the West. NATO Secretary General said that there are no signs of Russia de-escalating tensions. European Council head Charles Michel said Moscow must choose between war and diplomacy. Diplomatic efforts have been ongoing since January, but they have so far apparently done little in defusing the crisis. For more on the latest with the quote-unquote Ukraine crisis, joining us in Kyiv, Peter Dickinson, Ukraine alert editor for the Atlantic Council, publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine, and Lviv Today. In Moscow, Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. In Washington, D.C., Klaus Laris, distinguished professor of history and international affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. First of all, I know very clearly that you are coming from very different perspectives, but it's important to have your voices heard and also to make sure that we understand the different perspectives with the eternal goal of making peace. I hope that's the goal of our conversation. So let me move to you, Mr. Sloboda, about the apparent withdrawal. A lot of different views about whether that is happening or not, what is the real intention of Russia, your view.
Yeah, despite the claims from the Russian government, the Russian defense minister, I surmise from both open source intelligence and simple logic that there is no substantial withdrawal that is going to be occurring. We may see some shuffling around of a number of battalion tactical groups, but indeed there seems to be more evidence that Russia continues to build up forces in the west of the country, an increased force posture in western Russia, on the Ukrainian border, and in Belarus. They have every intention of keeping up these hardball negotiation tactics as they continue to try to pin down the West, to getting their security guarantees and forcing the regime in Kyiv to finally live up to the Minsk Accords that they signed way back in 2015.
Professor Laris, from Washington's perspective, we see a lot of news coming out, a lot of information, false or true, about what Washington's assessment of Moscow's intention. Now, at this point, how much do you think Washington will be able to have its diplomatic maneuvering space in terms of working with Russia, if both are thinking about the goal for peace?
Yeah, I think there is still room for dialogue. That is what Putin said, that is what Biden said, that is what all European leaders said. So I think we are not seeing an escalation of the crisis right now. All sides are interested in talking. And no one in NATO actually wants Ukraine to join NATO. Therefore, there should be the possibility, there should be room to come to a compromise. Of course, we cannot give Russia the right to a veto, as the West keeps saying. Therefore, some sort of intermediate solution has to be found, which reassures Russia, but which also makes sure that the West doesn't give up its principles. But it should be possible to find a compromise solution for all sides involved.
Mr. Dickinson, you are in Kyiv, so tell us more about how do you see the Ukrainians are looking and assessing the diplomatic maneuvering that is taking place, for example, from France, from Germany, who have somewhat different views, at least different approaches compared to Washington. Mr. Dickinson.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, I think that there is concern in Kyiv that there may be some daylight between the positions adopted in Berlin and Paris compared to what we're seeing from Washington. The main priority from a Ukrainian point of view is that the West remains united and continues to offer a very clear position to Moscow that there will be no compromise on the key issues, on Ukrainian sovereignty, on Ukrainian independence, and on Ukraine's right to seek NATO membership at some point in the future. Though I think your previous commentator was quite correct in saying that there's very little appetite for Ukrainian membership. Ukraine seeks NATO membership purely because it's been attacked by Russia. There was no appetite for NATO membership in Ukraine as well until 2014. So I think there is room somewhere for compromise, but it's very delicate because the West cannot be seen to concede Ukraine's right to seek NATO membership officially to Moscow. This has become a very principled issue, and it's a bizarre confrontation in a sense because it's an issue that actually is not current. All sides recognise that there is no chance of Ukrainian membership in the foreseeable future, and yet the barriers to finding a middle ground are quite strong.
Mr. Sloboda, how do you see that, shall I say, already quite obvious difference, let's say, from capitals like Paris and Berlin compared to Washington? Some even suggest that Washington is adding coal to the fire, while Paris and also Berlin is trying to calm down the situation. Now, I don't know whether that's too extreme to illustrate in that way, but there is clear difference about the attitudes and approaches. How do you see that difference?
Well, I think the West has kind of long perfected a kind of good cop, bad cop routine with the Europeans often playing the role of the good cop and the U.S., well, just playing the role of bad. But certainly there has been a frantic amount of shuttle diplomacy by Macron and the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, from Moscow to Kyiv to Washington, back and forth. And I think, the results of the last few days with the Russian president deciding not to intervene in Ukraine yet and not to recognize the Donbass republics as independent from the regime in Kiev.
All right. Professor Laris, how do you see that? It's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Disconnected.
We are connected, actually.
Yes.
We are connected, Mr. Sloboda.
It is. I quite agree. I mean,
Professor Laris, go ahead.
Both sides are afraid of war, and yes, both sides are afraid of war, and Putin is clearly impressed by the threats from the West regarding severe sanctions. Because otherwise, if he didn't fear that he wouldn't actually get too much from an invasion, why hasn't he invaded already? So I think Putin is not interested in an invasion, but he wants to get the benefits of his military threat. And some compromise, as I said before, has to be found.
But my
and
question
that compromise
more, Professor
probably
Laris,
has to come from Ukraine.
Yeah,
if
but
Ukraine
my question more, if I could repeat it, is about the apparent difference of at least approaches among the West capitals, let's say Paris, Berlin, and Washington. How do you see these apparent differences? Will they be able to compromise or be able to figure out a way?
There are some differences. There are some differences. I think the Europeans are more afraid of going to war than the United States is, and that has got something to do with European history. After all, the American continent has never been conquered by a foreign power, and of course the European continent has. So Scholz and Macron and everyone else is more afraid of war than the United States. However, in the last resort, none of the participants in this conflict wants a war. They want to achieve a compromise, and I think that also applies to Biden and Blinken and the whole American establishment. And I think Putin is also interested in a compromise, but both sides need to gain something. Putin could not withdraw and de-escalate, as they say, without having achieved something. What would that look like? He would lose face to his own public opinion. So he has to achieve something.
Okay.
But the West, of course,
What
cannot concede
something?
too much.
What
but
is,
I think a
what
compromise
is
is still possible.
What is that something, Mr. Dickinson? Do you think think there is a space to work that out? What does it take to work that out, Mr. Dickinson?
Well, this is the key question, I think, that everybody in the world is asking now, not only here in Ukraine. What does Putin actually want? I think on a fundamental level, he wants Ukraine. I think he's made that very clear in his personal writings, in the remarkable essay he published last summer, in which he questioned the historical legitimacy of Ukrainian statehood and said that Ukraine and Russia were one people, a sentiment he's often expressed. So I think fundamentally this is where he'd like to be. At this stage, what does he want from the current crisis? Well, certainly concessions. He already knows, and he's already said that he understands that Ukraine will not join NATO soon.
So Mr. Dickinson, what you're trying to say to me seems to be that you don't think there is any maneuvering of diplomacy? So you don't think diplomacy will have any space? But to me, it seems quite interesting over the past few days how events evolve. It seems that diplomacy are pretty much at play.
Yeah, there is always room for diplomacy in any conflict. You see diplomacy in world wars. You know? So there's no conflict in the history of humanity that is absolutely beyond the reach of diplomacy. We see diplomacy in the Israel-Palestine conflict.
But this is not the Israel and Palestine conflict. This is not a world war yet. We have to clarify that.
Especially from France and Germany.
Sorry, we have a lot of time difference between you and me in terms of...
but the point I'm making is that there is always... Yeah.
Go ahead, you say? There is always room for diplomacy, but the thing is how hard we want diplomacy to work, whether we genuinely believe and also work toward a resolve through diplomacy, isn't it?
Certainly, certainly. I think in this context we're seeing from France and Germany are trying to take a lead in the diplomatic front, whereas the United States and the United Kingdom, to a lesser extent, are showing a much more uncompromising stance.
I see.
But I think all sides are committed to avoiding war. There's absolutely no drum beats for war anywhere, and I think the Ukrainians also recognize that they must work on a diplomatic level and are very active at the moment. But to a large degree, Ukraine is being sidelined in the top table diplomacy that is currently taking place.
I see. Mr. Laris, we only have 20 seconds. So how will diplomacy work, do you think, the best way, if you can? 20 seconds.
I think Ukraine has to go for two possibilities. One, to bring forward the Minsk process and participate actively. And secondly, to promise that they will not want to join NATO for the very long future. These 2 points, I think, need to be fulfilled. And on the basis of these 2 points, I think a compromise might well be possible between all sides involved, including Putin, the Ukrainians, and the West.
All right. We are running out of time. I know that we need to have more time for Mr. Sloboda, but we are having connections on and off. This is a live show, unfortunately. But I want to thank all of you for joining us and express your perspective. I really appreciate that. Peter Dickinson, Mark Sloboda, and Klaus Laris, thank you so much for joining us.